Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Connections with myself, Cameron Bunch, and my father, Dr. Randy Lane Bunch. It's great to have you guys back for another week. Last week, we kind of just took a break from normal talks and just had a bit of shop talk, as we called it, just talking about our gear and why it's kind of important for ministry, especially in this day and age, to be more acquainted with technology, with different camera gear, sound gear, lighting. And I think for a long time, I would say in ministry, sound gear has been understood more because there's been a lot of ministries that have involved preaching from a stage. So you want a good mic to be heard. And then you have a lot of ministry involving praise and worship. And there's been a lot of very talented praise and worship ministries and that have turned into bands, even like I think one of the more notable ones that at least when I was young was Hillsong. And they're still notable, but that was kind of to me the first band church that I could remember. But because of this, I think sound and audio the audio area got a lot of credit and a lot of focus. However, video and lighting did not as much. And when things especially exploded into the online era with COVID, things changed. So if you guys kind of want to hear what we had to say regarding that last week, go ahead and go check that out. However, for this week, we're going to be changing our directions again, as we often do, and just kind of be talking about the idea of what a lot of people refer to as echo chambers. Now, we'll get into that a bit later of what is an echo chamber and kind of get into that idea. But we also want to just deal with a lot of presuppositions that people have. We have implicit biases that we are raised with, that we're not born with them, but as we're raised and go through adulthood and mature into the people we are today, we all go through life with these different biases, which are formed by our families, our upbringings, our friends, our teachers, whatever influences that we have going into us, whether it's sports, academia, church. We're all having these biases dumped into our brains, and we kind of don't realize it for a lot of period of our life. We just kind of take it for granted. That's the truth of the world.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when you see people arguing about, well, this is my truth. Well, the reality is that truth is subjective. There is no my truth, your truth. What we often mean is my opinion, your opinion, my upbringing, your upbringing, my culture, your culture. The reality is that it isn't truth most of the time. It's an opinion we're arguing over. So we kind of want to get into that area. So why don't you just start us off, Dad?
Yeah, I want to read a verse of scripture that I think is a great place to start. And it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, maybe even a little further. It says, "Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies." Or we could say it this way: knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Then he goes on to say, and this is great, "If anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know." And then he goes on to say, "But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him." And so really, what really got me thinking about this, Cameron, this isn't just, something that occurred to us today and said, hey, let's talk about this. This is something that has been growing as a realization in me for a long, long time. And I think what really helps is if any of our listeners have had the opportunity to cross what we might call doctrinal boundaries, denominational boundaries, if they've had the opportunity to read widely, explore different facets and areas and segments of the church, and interact with believers who think about certain maybe doctrines or social issues or whatever differently than themselves, and found out, hey, these people aren't monsters after all, or, they're not the enemy, then those are the people that can appreciate what we're saying. But there's going to be a group of people out there, whether they're listening to this broadcast or not, I know because I was one of them, that would almost feel that we had to not demonize in a literal sense, but somehow villainize or marginalize, that's the better word, those who didn't see things exactly the way that we did. I grew up Southern Baptist, and this is not to say that all Southern Baptists are like this at all. This is talking about me and my assumptions. And really what we're talking about is a failure to challenge our own assumptions tonight. But I remember, Cameron, that I had two really good school friends. We walked to school together from about 5th grade through, gosh, I don't know, till we learned to drive. And they were Catholic. And they would tell me how Peter was the first pope, and I would tell them how Jesus was Baptist. And of course, neither one of us had any clue what we were talking about. But it highlights this thing about something that Paul Scanlon, a favorite communicator of both of ours, has said before. He said that our context shapes us by stealth. There are certain assumptions that we have about reality, about theology, about life, about any number of things, that those assumptions came to us honestly because they were ingrained into us by people whom we love and trust. I mean, our parents weren't trying to steer us wrong. Our pastor wasn't trying to steer us wrong. Our denomination wasn't trying to steer us wrong. Obviously, they shared with us the assumptions and beliefs that they thought to be true. And those things shaped us. And of course, these are wonderful, truthful, honest, loving people. Of course, they told us the truth. And so for me, that meant, well, of course, the Baptists were right. And there was a kind of a joke that was going around. I didn't know how pervasive this was particularly considered to be a Baptist thing until some of my full gospel friends told me a joke one time, and they said that two people, an angel was escorting someone through heaven, and there was the Assemblies of God over here, and then there was the Lutheran over here, and then they snuck by the Baptist quarter of heaven. They said, "Why are we being so quiet?" And they said, "Because they think they're the only ones here." And there's this kind of joke about we're so right, and of course, as time went on in my life, certain assumptions that I held concerning that Southern Baptist doctrine were challenged, and some of those assumptions were successfully challenged and overturned, not on the major doctrines of the faith. I still believe everything that I believed in the Baptist church. I've just added a few things to it and maybe modified and tweaked a few things. But when it comes to the fundamentals of the faith, I believe the same way fundamentally that I did growing up. But I've also learned to appreciate things concerning the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the modern day operation of those gifts, and so forth and so on. So what I think is unfortunate is that there are many believers out there today that are still refusing to even look at the assumptions that they've held to be true, let alone challenging them. They won't even tolerate any questioning whatsoever of any point of doctrine or of any particular opinion or whatever. And as a result of that, because they're living, as you called it, an echo chamber, because they're living within an echo chamber, only hearing opinions that agree with their own, they have cut themselves off from any possibility of further growth. And so this is kind of what I want to talk about tonight, what we're going to be talking about tonight, and particularly as it relates to, I have a heart for ministers, Cameron. I teach at a Bible college. I'm 58 now, and so I've lived a long ministerial career life, and I'm still serving as a minister in several different capacities, obviously. And I wish to impart what little wisdom I've accumulated on to the other generation coming up, like yourself and others coming up behind us. And one of the things that I think is so unfortunate, like I said, and limiting for a lot of preachers, is there's nothing wrong with having your camp. I think that's even a good thing. But I think when we become so narrow that we can't see beyond it or fail to even recognize that there is a beyond it, we hamstring ourselves from the potential of further growth. And, God forbid that we should find out the other camp was right and we were wrong about something. And I think that unfortunately there's so little of this, call it intellectual curiosity, theological curiosity, life curiosity among people, and particularly believers. I'm talking primarily about believers today, and we're really focusing in maybe on the doctrinal side of things, but I think even in social issues or in life in general, we can be so myopic and see things only a certain way that it prohibits our growth and limits us in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And there's a couple things I want to, first, I want to define echo chamber because we've now gotten into and we've mentioned it. When you think about an echo, you're in a cave and you say something out, all you hear back is what you said. That's the idea of an echo chamber. Is it's a mental discourse, really, more when it's used, is that if my dad and I were having a conversation, for example, and we could be talking about, let's make it easy, football. If my dad were talking about football, he'd probably start talking about how good Tom Brady is as a quarterback. And me being someone who, even though I'm not a big fan of football, I like athletes that are just great at what they do. So I probably echo back the same thing of like, yeah, Tom Brady's just such a great quarterback. And we would just echo back the same sentiments back and forth. We wouldn't have like let's say someone who is obsessed with Raiders come in and say, no, Derek Carr's the best quarterback. We'd kind of be like, we wouldn't even invite that conversation in. And that's what the reality is of an echo chamber, is you only have the same ideas being thrown back and forth and never anything new introduced. So that's the idea behind the echo chamber. And I think it becomes particularly dangerous when we're not willing to leave behind or consider anything from outside. Like you said, it was kind of the joke of the Baptist of like, shh, they don't know anyone else is here. And the reality is, oftentimes I think as humans, we prefer it that way because it's more comfortable. The reality is, when you have your challenges, like your beliefs attacked, you get defensive and you get angry. And that's just the nature of people. When we have our core beliefs challenged, we get defensive and angry. The reality is that we shouldn't hold those core beliefs too strictly, because the reality is there's probably going to be a lot of things that we're wrong with. And I remember I was having a discussion with someone one time in college, and I'm like, I'm okay with the reality that I'm going to get to heaven and God's probably going to tell me I'm wrong on a lot of things. And they're like, what? And I'm like, I'm okay with the reality that I don't know everything. And I'm like, and I don't want to see everything through just the lens of what I believe. I'm like, there's so many people out there that are much smarter than me, that are much wiser than me. Am I really so arrogant to be able to say I know better than all of them? No, I could be way off to bat. But the reality is, we as Christians should be pursuing God, not our camps.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, let's go into politics. Politics is an easier one because I don't want to get into bashing any denominations, because the reality is I think a lot of denominations do a lot of things really well. But let's look at politics. I'm self-identified as someone who is more conservative, I would say. And I think that I've made that very publicly known. But the reality is, I like having a lot of liberal friends, and a lot of people find that incredibly frustrating and think I'm just a sellout. But the reality is, how am I ever going to learn anything if I'm only hanging out with conservative people?
Yeah.
And the reality is, I've found a lot of liberal friends who identify as Christian. And you're like, well, I don't know how that could be. If they're a liberal, they obviously don't love Jesus. But then you look at some of their perspectives. They just disagree with methods realistically. For a lot of them, they care about those, the orphan, or the down on the disparaged and down on their luck. And they think that God would love them and that we should take care of them. I agree. I just don't think that the state should fund it, and they do. And so it's a difference of methodology there. It doesn't mean that they're liberal on every single issue. It doesn't mean that I'm conservative on every single issue. There's give and take. I think the reality is that we shouldn't be pursuing a political party. Am I red? Am I blue? But are we pursuing Jesus? Are we pursuing his ideology, his thoughts? And I think the same goes back to different camps of thought. And it was something that I found in college that I ended up appreciating, being part of a ministry that was interdenominational, meaning that they welcomed all denominations. And it's a little different than non-denominational, because non-denominational, just they kind of pick and choose what they want, and that just becomes that denomination realistically. Their core beliefs become it. But interdenominational welcomes all denominations in. And the thing that I found incredibly fascinating about it is that I ended up loving a lot of things that different denominations did very well. When I'd find Baptist people, I found out, hey, they're really good at reading the word and memorizing the word and like applying it. When I met Lutherans, I was like, wow, they really know what they believe, because they have a lot of liturgy in their church. And while it's not my favorite thing that I'd want to do every day, you ask any of them what they believe, they'll recite one of their liturgical creeds or one of their expressions that they say every single week. And so they knew what they believed, and they found beauty in those traditions. And I thought that was great. And you can go on and on. What is it about Pentecostals? Well, their church doesn't feel dead when you go to it. And I mean that in no offense towards other denominations, but I think there's a lot of denominations where music and worship just isn't as encouraged. And you go to a Pentecostal church and you'll see them very welcoming towards the worship and to dancing and expressing in that way. And the reality is, David was a man who danced before the Lord with all his might. And all these things are part of our Bible that we read, but we often section them off to different denominations, and we don't get to see the whole picture. And that's the danger, I think. The biggest danger of an echo chamber is we miss out on the entirety of God by just sectioning off a bit of him. We look at him and we're like, well, I just like this arm of him. This one arm of him is really good, and I like that one piece.
Yeah. Another danger about being too doctrinally myopic, is I remember growing up, and I'm using the Southern Baptist context because that was mine. And again, I'm not saying this in any way to fault the Southern Baptists. I have a very high regard for many Southern Baptists, so it has nothing to do with that. I'm just giving my example. But I remember as a young child, I understood enough about redemption to know, even before I was saved, what I needed to do to get saved. And I understood that Jesus died for my sins. Did I understand all the ramifications of redemption? No. But I understood enough to know that I needed to make some kind of personal commitment. But the way that played out in our church was that when you got ready to make that decision, when you got under conviction, however words you want to use, then during an invitation, altar call, whatever, in our context, you would walk to the front. And then you would acknowledge to the pastor. I'm making this extensive so you understand where the missing links later come. You'd say, I want to give my heart to Jesus. He may pray a prayer with you right there, or he may, at the end of the invitation, have you all turn to the audience and say, these are people who've made a commitment to Christ. And in some cases, they might usher you to a prayer room where you're individually prayed for. But at the end of the day, what they're looking to do is see you make a personal commitment. And sometimes we would call it a sinner's prayer. We'll pray a sinner's prayer. All of that is perfectly fine, and I would even say biblical. But there is no sinner's prayer in the Bible, nor are there any instructions in the Bible that during the third stanza of Just As I Am, you should have everyone come forward to the front, shake the preacher's hand. So here's what happens. Once we divorce a given, say, cultural practice, I'm talking about church culture, like the Baptist culture or the Pentecostal culture or the Lutheran culture or the Episcopal culture or whatever, the Catholic culture. Once we divorce the culture or the, like you said, the liturgy, the habits of the church, the form of service, the style, once we do that long enough without going back to the word and finding out why we do it, then after a while we have kind of like an empty wineskin. In other words, we no longer have the scriptural backing of why we do stuff. It's just tradition. This is why grandma did it. This is the way her generation did it. It's the way my parents did it. Now this is what we do. When we get ready to get saved, we come to the front, we talk to the preacher, and then we do something. You know what I'm saying? It begins to lose the scriptural foundation behind it. So instead of coming forward, believing in our heart, confessing with our mouth Jesus is Lord, and making an authentic connection with God, maybe we just shake the preacher's hand or become members of the church or get water baptized, none of which are necessarily a communication of the heart's faith with God. So what we're doing now is following a form and a style. Now, behind those forms and styles, right, was originally a biblical principle that we were endeavoring to follow to the best of our ability. In other words, you believe in your heart and confess through your mouth, Romans 10, 9, and 10, right? That's kind of the root of the sinner's prayer. But there is no sinner's prayer written out, nor does it say you come to the front. So what I'm saying is, if all you're doing is practicing style and form, then after a while, you still have people coming forward, shaking the preacher's hand, maybe not even knowing exactly why they're coming or what they're supposed to do when they get there, and they leave and go home and think something's transpired when they've never even made a connection with God. The same thing happens with, like, for example, in the Church of England, if somebody's going to make a commitment to Christ, like C.S. Lewis came, he was the Church of England, right? And he talks about how when he was a young man, the greatest hypocrisy that he ever committed was when it came time for him to be confirmed, even though he was a complete atheist by that time, he went ahead and did it just so he didn't have to argue and fight with his dad. And when he would talk about that, like in Surprised by Joy, in the recent movie that they did about his life, he talks about this, how he was guilty of blasphemy as far as he was concerned. Even as a grown man, he saw that as a blasphemous act because it was hypocrisy. So when an Anglican believes, he might go and take their sacrament, the bread and the wine, but now he's doing it as a believer. That's his sinner's prayer. He's acting in faith on what he believes, and that's his sinner's prayer, if you will. You see what I'm saying? In the book of Acts, you cannot get away from the reality that when somebody wanted to commit their life to Christ, they got baptized. Jesus even said, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. Now, we're not saying water saves anybody. That had nothing to do with it. It has to do with the communication of your faith publicly, and you're identifying with Christ. The way they did that was water baptism. It was a profession of faith. So it's the communication of the faith heart. So you can do it in a sinner's prayer. You can do it through baptism. You can do it through the Eucharist, right? You can do it through all these things. But my point is that we get so used to a particular form. No, you didn't do it this way. You have to come to the front. You have to, well, who said? Why do you believe that? Why do you believe what you believe? And again, a lot of times we inherit these forms of doing certain things a certain way. And somebody needs to, every once in a while, every generation needs to stop and say, now, why are we doing it this way? And maybe looking across the aisle at what others are doing and understanding why they do it that way. And it's not that we have to abandon our form for someone else's, but we need to understand the scriptural roots behind why we do what we do. Or form becomes form without substance. You see what I'm saying? And so one of the reasons why I think it's important that we challenge our assumptions is because our assumptions were handed to us. They like I said, context shapes us by self. I grew up in Southern Baptist Church. We went to the front, but I'm telling you, Cameron, I know from I would be hugely surprised if I was not right about the fact that many people went forward not really knowing what they were going forward for, what they were supposed to do, and left relatively unchanged. I know because I've seen that transpire in the lives of people that, did the form, but there was no communication of their heart faith toward God. So this is another reason why I think it's really important that we challenge our assumptions and ask ourselves, okay, we do certain things a certain way. Why? Is there merit in it? Is there a better way to do this? And so this is just one reason why we can't assume, right? In my line of work, I meet people of all sorts of kind of denominational, I guess you could say, preferences and whatnot. And one of the things I'm wanting to know is, are you at peace spiritually? That's part of my job, is to ensure that people are at peace spiritually. And I remember, I'll give you an example completely unrelated to my job because I feel more comfortable doing it this way. I remember one time, Cameron, years ago, I was at a park and I was trying to do soul winning, kind of like we do when we're zealous for God. And there was a guy there holding a bottle of Budweiser, looking past me and my companion that were desperately trying to win him to Christ, at the two girls in the park that he was far more interested in. And we said something about, do you know Jesus? And he looked at us dismissively and waved his hand and said, oh, yeah. My mom's Catholic. As though, that sealed the deal. But where did he get that? Some form that was handed to him that, because of assumptions that went unchallenged, he thought that had some kind of substance to it. Obviously, no Catholic who's an authentic Catholic would think that did it. You know what I'm saying? So this is part of what we're talking about, as well as just not being fooled by the assumptions that we're right and everybody else is wrong.
I think another point we can bring in too is that when we live in an echo chamber, we cut off part of our body. We cut off an opportunity for growth and maturing. And through that, like the man in the park, we lose the ability to connect with him, because you're not going to be able to connect with a man in that place if you live in an echo chamber, because you don't understand his background. You don't understand where he's coming from. And most of the time, I think we're unwilling to understand, because oftentimes we don't want to do the work to go to the other side to understand there. We just want to pull them over to our side. It's kind of like a tug of war. It's like, can we pull them harder? But the reality is, and I've said the expression on here before, it's a person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. No matter what, if you're trying to convince them and they just don't believe it, if you're convincing them against their will, against their willingness to change or to accept information, they're going to be of the same opinion, and it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah.
And the reality is, so much of the church isn't able to reach into the lost world because we alienate the lost world. We're not willing to understand, or because oftentimes there's a lot of brokenness in there. But I think one of the beautiful things that Jesus did is that he went into people's lives and he called them out by name. He knew who they were. He didn't go up to Zacchaeus and be like, hey, you're a sinner and a loser, but you need to come over to my side. He said, hey, I'm coming to eat at your house tonight. And he called them by name. He knew him, and he had already known his background. Now, Jesus had a little more help in that department of like the supernatural knowing of his background at that point. But the reality is, we each live lives. We have jobs. We have coworkers. We have the ability to get into people's lives, to understand where they're coming from. And it's always the people that we get to know at the deepest parts that are willing to hear us in the moments that they need it. If we're always coming in with a great attitude and caring about them, being interested in their lives, to what's going on, when something happens, they're willing to listen. But if we're going in just ignoring them all the time, acting superior to them, coming in with a bad attitude, complaining, grumbling, all these things, but we're not willing to hear what's going on in their life, and we're like, well, no matter what you say, you're wrong. and they're living a better life than you, then it's just that hypocrisy again, like you were talking about, the Lewis face, that we often are in this own echo chamber of like, my way is right, your way is wrong. And I remember when I was little, um, and I don't think it probably changed until somewhere in high school, but I just always had this idea that if you didn't believe in God, you could never be a good person. Like, and I mean, if we're talking biblically, like, yeah, no one is good. We understand that. But like, I just thought like no one that like knew God was really capable of doing great things. And the reality is like, oh, like that didn't really matter. Like there's a lot of people that aren't like Christians that I was probably a little before high school. I can't remember, but it was just this like closed off mindset that I was like, well, Christians are the ones that do great things, and like atheists are the ones that are jerks, and like all these different things. And then I realized, I think it's more that when I was younger, I didn't have connection with a lot of groups. I ended up switching to homeschooling very young and was just involved with the church. And I don't regret any of that. I got to learn a lot about God and had great relationships growing up. But it wasn't until getting involved with other people and seeing different people and getting to hang out with friends that really had completely different upbringings, different beliefs, different backgrounds, that I realized I have no ability to connect with these people if I don't learn to care about them, if I don't learn to understand them. And the reality is that I'm trying to remember what the expression is, that gosh, I'm not going to remember. It's something along the lines of ignorance is the greatest form of stupidity. And it's because our unwillingness to learn about someone is what makes us stupid. And I don't mean that in a condescending, rude way. I think that anytime we decide that someone's not worth getting to know, we're choosing to make ourselves dumber for that, that we're choosing to cut off a part of opportunity to learn and grow. Because there's a lot of ideas and a lot of books that I've read that I'm like, I disagree with this completely, but I can understand it. And our willingness to be able to understand where people are and meet them there is one of our greatest abilities to evangelize, to reach into their lives and preach hope and just make a difference for them.
Yeah, there is a great story my spiritual father, Brother Hagen, told us many years ago when the Word of Faith was, kind of getting traction, and he was recognized as a leader or the leader of the Word of Faith movement, which most people, almost everyone that I hear tell me what they think Word of Faith is wrong. I mean, especially I'm talking about people criticizing it when they have their assumptions of what they think we believe. They're wrong completely. I've very seldom heard anybody get it right. There was a critic, like, going after him. But Brother Hagen said that he happened to be at this larger conference, and there was a man there that was a critic of him and of some of the things that he taught. And Brother Hagen said he's in the audience, and this man's behind the pulpit, and he's saying some things he said that I know were for my benefit, criticism wise. He didn't say, "Hey, this is for you," but Brother Hagen knew that, okay, this is probably for me. That he's trying to help me, correct me, whatever. And he said it would have been very easy for me to shut him off, and recognizing maybe that his motive was, just to get him or to let him know I don't agree with you. But he said I kept an open heart. And one of the things Brother Hagen was always quick to say is, when people criticize you, the first thing you should do is analyze it. Is there any constructive criticism? Is there something you can learn from it? He said, but I didn't shut him off. I just continued to kind of keep an open heart. And he said, when he got off of that and started going back to his message, he began to say some things, he said, that answered questions I had had for years. Now, I think this was so special for him to share this with us for a number of reasons. Number one is because it could have easily put him in not the best of light, that he learned something from somebody who had criticized him for the things that he held. But Brother Hagen was secure enough in his own faith and his own walk with God that he could recognize, okay, I don't agree with this guy in this area, but hey, he knew something I didn't know over here. Let me just assure all of us, that's true with every single one of us. There are things that your quote unquote doctrinal enemy on the other side of a doctrinal aisle knows that you don't know. Absolutely. And has had experiences, authentic experiences in God that you've not had, and vice versa. So the fact of the matter is, and I've shared very publicly on this platform before, Cameron, that I get really weary with people that are mean-spirited critics of men and women of God whom they disagree with in what I would consider to be secondary, if not minor, but oftentimes secondary doctrinal issues, and call them heretics. When if you were to ask those same people whom they're criticizing, hey, do you believe in the Nicene Creed? Do you believe in the fundamental tenets of the faith? Every one of them would say, yeah, I believe in the virgin birth. I believe in salvation by grace through faith in Christ alone. I believe in, bodily resurrection. I believe, and if they were to go through all of those, and we're just looking at the Nicene Creed, you believe in, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, they would agree with all of that. And so the fact of the matter is, we're not only are we being mean-spirited and critical and not reflecting Christ, but we're shutting ourselves up from an opportunity to learn something. There's a reason why people believe what they believe. I mean, they were persuaded by some kind of argument, right? So that must mean there is some merit in the argument, even if we don't wholly agree with it. Maybe there's things in it that we can glean from. And so I think just to shut ourselves off because maybe we were offended, and sometimes people can be caustic in their delivery, and so we feel defensive. And I think anytime people get defensive, it is an indicator of insecurity. There's no reason to get defensive if you know you're right. We say this in apologetics sometimes. If you have a good defense, you don't have to be defensive. If you have a good argument, there's no reason for you to be argumentative. But the reason why I think a lot of people are defensive and argumentative is because they themselves are insecure, or, of course, one of the greatest ways of growing an audience is by taking on someone who has achieved a certain measure of success and notoriety. And so, it's kind of like being the moon to their sun. You get a little bit of reflected light by criticizing the other fella. And I think it's a shame that much of our dialogue, particularly in social media, has degenerated to that kind of thing, rather than having constructive conversations like this, where we're saying, hey, maybe there's something we can learn from one another. There was, I forget, you were talking about, there was a couple ministers, I forget, I could tell you the name of one of them, but they would sit down around a table and talk about, what they disagree about. And do you remember what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. And these two guys they're actually even the same denomination pretty much, but they were still fighting each other over certain doctrinal points. And the one guy said, well, ask me a question. And so they were asking about certain basic tenets of the faith. And of course, he agreed completely with them. And this is happening all the time. And a lot of times, sometimes it's semantics, but one of the things I see is a lot of misrepresentations of what other people believe. And I sometimes don't know if that's honest, because they heard somebody else say, well, so-and-so said this, and they didn't say that at all. But they heard someone quote that they said this. And so we have to be very careful about our source material. Are we being honest? Are we really trying to promote truth, or are we just trying to promote our YouTube subscribers? Things like that. I think we have to be very careful.
And I think when we look even in our secular world, whether it's politics or we look at the church and its denominations, anytime we see someone and we say like, well, they said this, and I think there's a couple things to examine there first. Did they actually say that? Like you said, is that the entirety of what they said, or is that a fraction or a segment of what they said taken out of context? 2, when they said what they said, was there a different meaning behind it? Was there a different intention of their heart? Or are you taking the words at printed value, I would say? And what I mean by printed value is, if I were to tell my dad, like, yeah, that movie was great, you print that out on paper and it's like, yeah, that movie was great. Was it, or was it not? You don't know based off what was printed in that piece of paper. You don't know that I'm using sarcasm. You don't know if I'm being adamant. And it was like, yeah, that movie was great. But when it's printed, you have no idea. So what was the value of the words that were actually being spoken? Did they mean what they said? Were they being tongue in cheek? And I think that's one of the realities, is that until we know the heart of someone and we really understand them, and that's what it takes, is getting out of this echo chamber. Because like we said, how often do you have people come up to you after you've made a statement publicly, or you've posted something on Facebook and messaged you privately, or come up to you afterwards and been like, hey, I'm just curious, like, you said this, this, and this. Is that what you meant, or did you mean this? I misunderstood possibly what you said. It sounded like you were saying this. Is that what you meant? And oftentimes, you if you'd have taken that stance, because I've messaged friends of mine before because they've posted something, I'm like, hey, you said this. Is this what you meant? Or were you meaning it sarcastically? And they're like, oh my goodness, like that was a typo. Like, let me fix that. And they're like, no, of course I don't mean that. I'm like, hey, I was just checking. I just wasn't sure. Or I had a lot of political classes. So I'd be like, people would be talking and I'd be like, well, you just said this. Is it because you believe this? And they're like, no, I guess I just didn't think of the way I said that. No, what I mean is, and I mean, think about if any of you have ever been in a relationship or married, how many times does this happen with the person that you are closest to? For all of you married people out there, you should know this. Your spouse is the person you love most in the world, and you are so close to them. But how many times are there miscommunications in your marriage? And I mean, this happens with my wife and I constantly. And like, it's been an issue like that I've been trying to work on where I'll misunderstand what she means and I get defensive because I just want to feel accepted. And so I feel like she's not understanding. And so I get defensive and it's the wrong maneuver. The reality is that I need to be like, hey, is that what you meant? Or did you mean this? And oftentimes the people in life, I don't think when we say things are meaning ill most of the time when they're making statements, when they're trying to inform people, but oftentimes we don't interpret it. We interpret it through the lens of our own understanding or our limited experiences. And so that's why it's all the more important to get out of our echo chambers to be able to understand people's different lived experiences. We all have different walks of life we've been through, different cultures, and they're worth understanding and exploring. And that's what makes life beautiful. I mean, if you went to every single restaurant and all they had was a cheeseburger, would you really be that grateful for a cheeseburger every day?
Right.
No,
Right.
you'd be like, man, this sucks. I want something else. Or if any of you have seen or read the book The Giver, they go through life without having stripped down all the beautiful things in life, the things that because emotions can cause trouble and it can cause miscommunication. And so they've dialed down the language, they've gotten rid of a bunch of things. And it's like 1984, if you're familiar with James Orwell's or George Orwell writing, not James, George. But it's one of those books where it's a dystopic future where they've stripped life of all the things that are beautiful. Or if you've seen the movie Equilibrium, has the same idea.
Yeah.
If we strip life down of all these things that are beautiful, it makes life boring. And we have this one track mindset and everything else just seems combative to that. But the reality is when we embrace those other cultures, the things that make life beautiful, the differences that God put in us, different languages, different preferences, different ideas of what is beautiful art or a creative like a sport or whatever it is, life is more beautiful when observed that way. And God has made those differences for a reason. But I think it gets very dangerous when we're only willing to live life in one pace and one track and never consider the other side.
Yeah, I have, like I said, I guess it helped me having crossed denominational lines. And then, as you know, Cameron, I've been in ministry for a long time, traveling, doing what we call Holy Ghost meetings, seeing the Spirit of God move in dynamic ways, healing ministry, go on about the supernatural side of things. But, a little over a decade ago, I realized I don't know how to talk to anybody that's uninitiated, that's not in the faith. And so God began to put me on this track of learning about biblical apologetics. And I ended up, after about 10 years of learning, I began teaching apologetics. Well, not 10 years, probably 5 years in, I started teaching biblical apologetics at Summit Bible College and have taught that class at least 5 times, I think. And one of the things that I noticed is that the people in the camp of apologetics, which tend to generally be more on the conservative evangelical side, would highly disagree with some of my charismatic friends, myself. They would disagree with me and they would disagree with my charismatic friends on some of the things pertaining to the gifts of the Holy Spirit or the modern day operation of the gifts for speaking in tongues and some of these things. But I wasn't going to them for that. I was going to them for what they had on apologetics. But I often thought, man, if you could get these two sides to talk to each other, because you've got this group over here that's really good at using things like logical argument, critical thinking. And then you've got this other group that has, experience in the operation of the gifts. Now, what if they were talking about each other, this is what they'd say. Yeah, you got these dry textbook ivory tower intellects, and then you've got these hyper emotional crazy people that have never spent a day in Bible college. And none of those things are true about the other necessarily. Now, they can be, stereotypes are there for a reason. Sometimes it is true. But by and large, people are more nuanced than that. They're layered. They're not, And I think that's such an unfair criticism on both sides of the coin. And I've heard guys that were brilliant apologetics try to discuss, for example, speaking in tongues and some of the gifts of the Spirit. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's the worst explanation, or, I've ever heard. And yet these people are brilliant, far greater than me in apologetics. So I'm not despising and cutting them out because they didn't get the question on tongues right, and vice versa. And it doesn't mean you have to live in that other camp or imbibe all their stuff, or swallow the whole thing. But we can be discerning. We can certainly grow from one another, and again, find out the other guy's not a monster. But unfortunately, we stay behind our high doctrinal walls and lob, stones at each other, trying to do damage rather than trying to mutually learn from one another. And I guarantee you, there's people out there that hear me say this, so I ain't got nothing to learn from them. And well, you're right. You probably don't. Not like that. You're not going to hear anything. But like I said, it to me, maybe the way I hear it when I hear somebody just leveling into someone because they have a different doctrinal persuasion on whether it's gifts of the Spirit or whether it's end times theology or whatever, as though that is the most important thing. And if you don't see it my way, you really probably aren't a Christian. To me, the presumption in that is so stark and so obvious to me. And it doesn't mean that they may not have a point or they may not be right, but the intolerance to me, again, comes from a certain measure of insecurity. There's a couple of guys that you guys, the Bible Project guys, they do make these wonderful animated videos. And I would say for sure that I hold different doctrinal positions from them on some things. For sure. I just know because we're all different, and I'm sure I do. And particularly maybe along certain lines of the charismata, stuff like that. But I love those guys. I appreciate the work they do. They do such a great work. And one of the things I appreciate about them, I think when they did their series on the book of Revelation, I kind of think I know where they stand doctrinally. But rather than saying, now this is what the Bible says, but this is what some other people think, they didn't put it that way. They kind of said there's various interpretations, and you could kind of tell where they were leaning by the way they phrased it, which that's perfectly fine. You don't want to be so, inarticulate or so indirect that you don't communicate anything. But they were very gracious, I thought, in the way they did that. And I think that that's just fair. And when I'm teaching in Bible college, for example, I'm teaching people from a diverse group of backgrounds. There are going to be people that are more Arminian, some are going to be more Calvinistic. I definitely have my leanings in a certain direction, but at the same time, I'm there to teach them something specific. And so I will sometimes express opinions that I know may not be universally held, and I'll try to make that clear that where I see it is this, or what I view is this, but I don't make that a dogmatic point of the class unless I'm teaching on something. Like if I'm teaching on the gifts of the Spirit, obviously I'm going to teach with the assumption and presumption of their truth, or else I wouldn't be teaching it. But when I'm teaching on something and something enters in where I know that maybe there's some conflict or disagreement here, my job is not to, certainly it's not to diminish or marginalize the people that disagree with me. But maybe what I can do is express some ideas that might open them up within their own assumptions. Somebody made a great statement one time about when Jesus would ask questions. Why did Jesus ask questions? Why do great teachers ask questions? Because it opens us up within our own assumptions. Why do you believe that? Well, what makes you say that? Why do you think that's true? And a lot of times people think of these as being provocational, or they're trying to provoke me. But really what they're trying to do is get you to ask yourself something. Why do you believe that? And if you can't answer it, rather than get defensive, say, yeah, why do I believe that? That might be a great question to ask yourself.
I think one of the greatest things that we can do is ask why. Now, don't get me wrong, you'll definitely get pushback at certain times, because I definitely do. But I think one of the things is if you show yourself genuine and you really do want to learn, when you ask why, a lot more people will be willing to answer than you think. Some people might get defensive, and I've had that many times because I can get very tedious with the why, because I think we take for granted sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so oftentimes when people go to explain like a matter, they might think you're at like 0.5, And you're like, no, I need to start at 1 before we get to 10. Like, you started me out 5. And so you have to ask them to go a couple steps back. And I've told people straight up before, I'm like, talk to me like I'm like 5, like I'm an idiot, like I know nothing. And I'm like, let's start from there. And once we get a baseline, we can go from there. Because the reality is, I want to learn at whatever cost. I don't care if it costs me like any point of pride or some image or ego. It doesn't matter. I mean, if the reality is that you're worried to lose a little bit of your ego to learn, then you really haven't lost much. I mean, and that's the reality of, it's worth it to just go in somewhere and ask why. I mean, think about it when it's at work and a boss comes to you and says, we're going to change things up. We're going to do it this way, and this way. Some people accept that and they just go with it. Sure. But a lot of times there are people that you have to ask well, why are we? And then oftentimes, if you have a good boss, they'll be able to lay out the reasons why they're making that shift. And in the end, you're persuaded of it and you're like, wow, that was really thoughtful, insightful, and I hadn't thought of it that way. And that's the reality of what our relationship should be like with others. That's the way our world should be, in that when we go into things, we're not immediately saying, well, that's just a bad idea because it's not my idea. Well, that's a terrible way to go into anything. I mean, one of my favorite things to do, for example, is try different foods. Why? Because my favorite food I may have never tasted yet. And that was probably true for a lot of my life. Some of my favorite food is Japanese food, and I don't really remember having any of it until I went to college. And I love Japanese food now, and I love having it all the time. And I have like this Japanese barbecue sauce like in my fridge that I'll occasionally just go and like drink a little bit of because it's so freaking delicious. And so the reality is, hey, you haven't tried it, you can't say anything. But that's the reality of like what we go through every day, is that some of the ideas we've never heard because we haven't stepped outside of our echo chambers might be the best ideas we have not yet heard. And once we hear them, we'll never be able to think the same way again. And that's when, for example, I mean, you were someone who was my health coach through my health journey. And it wasn't until you started your health journey and told me about the program you were a part of that I was like, there must be something to it, because I saw results. And until I was willing to put aside my biases, my thoughts of how was the best way for me to lose weight, how could I best do my health journey, till I put that aside, I had no knowledge of it. Did it cost me a little bit of my ego? Did it cost me a bit of discipline? Did it cost me a lot of frustration having to stick to it? Yeah. But was it worth it in the end? Absolutely. And that's the reality of life, is that anything worth doing is going to cost something from us. It's going to require discipline, and it's going to require us taking that patience and understanding to see that other perspective.
And another thing, we're not saying you have to abandon your convictions. One of the reasons why you want to explore the other side of the argument is to affirm in some cases,
Absolutely.
your convictions. In other words, until I've heard the best arguments against what I believe, I can't fully know that what I believe is true. You can't say, well, I know it's true beyond a shadow of a doubt, until I've heard the best argument contrary to it. And so if I'm unwilling to hear it, that says a lot about, again, my insecurity. There's nothing more frightening than thinking, what if I and my parents and everyone I trusted was wrong? It doesn't mean that they weren't sincere, but you can be sincerely wrong. And this is what happens with a lot of young people. As you know, Cameron, people are raised to believe something, and then they start challenging their assumptions, or somebody else challenges them for them, like a college professor, and all of a sudden they realize they never did the due diligence to hear those arguments. And as a result of that, they're talked out of what they believe simply because they don't have a defense against those arguments they had never heard. Were they wrong to begin with? No, maybe not at all, but they didn't ever hear the counter argument because, number one, those kinds of arguments weren't welcomed. Just sit down, shut up, believe what we tell you. You don't need, don't be smart with me, young man, that kind of stuff, rather than saying, well, let me hear what you have to say, and maybe I can address that. I can help you understand more clearly why we believe what we believe. And I don't ever remember a dialogue growing up in my denominational context where we entertained the ideas of the other guys. I'm talking about, like, say, Baptist, Pentecostal, or whatever. And and this again, this is a bigger thing now because of global knowledge. Kids can go to the internet and feed on all sorts of nonsense or junk and start buying into it because they've never heard a defense against certain philosophies, ideologies, whatever. And we hear these stories of young children in America going off and joining the flipping Taliban or something like that. It's like, how did that happen? Well, they got brainwashed, but that meant that their brain wasn't set with some kind of good arguments beforehand to keep them from getting into error. We've said it before that the way that the U.S. Treasury teaches their staff to recognize a counterfeit is by getting them so acquainted with the authentic article. They'll have a 3-day conference and never handle a single counterfeit dollar bill, but they'll look at the 20s and the hundreds and all the various features of an authentic bill, so that when they slip one, even the feel of the paper, they slip one in their hand that's not authentic, immediately they know it because they know the authentic so well. And I think we need to be willing to hear the rigorous arguments or put our faith through whatever rigorous arguments. And one other thing, when we read widely, and I'm not talking about reading widely like just reading junk, but I'm talking about entertaining an understanding of why other people maybe think the way they do. One of the things reading widely does is it gives us language to begin to express ourselves. Like you said, if we're not listening to the other individual, we don't have understanding of them. Reading does this for you also. Reading gives you language to express yourself. I often say I used to be more so. These days I listen to more books than I do read because of the way my schedule is, but I still listen quite a bit. But one of the things I loved about reading out of my iPad, Cameron, was oftentimes I'd come across a word that I did not know. And I'm not dumb. I've got a pretty extensive vocabulary, but I would come across words all the time that, authors that are more educated than I do used in their writing. And what I loved about my iPad, you can't do this with a paper book, but you can push that word and all of a sudden dictionary will pop up. You push the meaning of it and you just learned yourself a brand new word. And then after a while, it gets integrated in your own vocabulary. And I remember one time somebody asking me, what does that word mean? And I began to explain it. It took me maybe 4 or 5 minutes to explain comprehensively what that word. Well, why didn't you just say that? Because that one word said in a fraction of a moment what it took me 5 minutes to explain to you. Once you know that, it's an economy of language and it's more accurate and concise to say it a certain way. Well, again, a lot of times what I've found in these theological debates are people are talking past one another. It's a semantic issue. And because we don't know one another's language, we may even be saying something relatively similar and fighting over, like Jesus said, straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. And it's important that I think we educate ourselves. We don't have to get necessarily into the mire of it. But like, for example, when you read a book on apologetics, they're going to say, here are some of the arguments against why we believe this or whatever. And here's our answer and response to that. But if you don't have an answer and response, again, if you've never heard the best argument against why you believe what you believe, how do you know that what you believe is true? And so to have the language to be able to express ourselves to somebody that comes from a different perspective, to have a full appreciation that what we hold to be true really is true, that it's, again, the moment we hold our assumptions unassailable, you can't question me, then we set ourselves up for failure because at some point, somebody's going to come along and challenge that argument that we never decided to examine ourselves.
I mean, that's the reason that why I went off to college in Hawaii, and I've told this before on this podcast, is the reason I went is that I wanted to make sure that everything I was told growing up and all the beliefs I had formed up into that point were really mine. Did I really believe it? And were they true? Were they good, right, pure? And if they were, then no amount of scrutiny I faced would shake them because the truth will stand supreme because all truth belongs to God. And if God is true, he will stand the test of time in every piece of information. And I mean, that doesn't mean that I didn't go back to my roots and ask for their opinion at times. I mean, there were times during college I would tell you, hey, I was faced with this argument today. What do you think about that? Because the reality is, growing up, I'm not going to get every single oppositional thought or idea being presented to me by my parents who believe in God. But atheists are going to be coming up with new arguments and new questions. And so I would talk with my dad because I knew he was a big fan of apologetics and what he thought. Or if I had something politically, I might reach out to one of my teachers from high school that I was like, hey, they talk about this a lot. Like, what's their, and I would reach out to different resources in my life and ask their ideas. I would read up on it, because the reality is, at the end of the day, you don't need to abandon everything you said and believe, like my dad said. Is the reality is you just need to question and be willing to learn, be willing to change if new evidence is presented. But the reality is, if what you believe is true, then it's going to stand the test of time. And the reality is, I want to stand more like Abraham Lincoln did, where he answered, sir, my concern is not whether God is on our side, but whether or not I am on God's side. And the reality is, God is always right. God is always true. And it's more important to be on his side than our side. And there's this book, and I haven't gotten into reading it, so I'm not making a recommendation. I just like the name of it. It's Truth Over Tribe. And I like that because the whole point of the book, and like I said, I'm not going to recommend it because I haven't read it. But like just the cover of it is like choosing the lamb over the elephant or the donkey, because in our society, we're so driven one way or the other. Are we conservative? Are we liberal? Are we atheist? Are we Christian? Are we this? Are we that? And we're just put in these like extremes of it's a black and white, but the reality is life is not just black and white. There are differences. Do we have to be fully Republican? Do we have to be fully Democratic? Now, I think it's pretty black and white of like, do you believe in God? Don't you believe in God? That's, you can't like get blurry on that one. But we can challenge our assumptions, and we can grow, and we can learn, and we can understand and know that life is more complicated than just what we were raised to believe, that our experiences are not the sum of all of humanity's experiences. What we went through is not what other people experience. I will never understand what someone who went through the Holocaust went through. That is not my experience in life. And to make an end all be all statement of I know everything and it be about that time in history and period of life, I have no experience in that. But someone who's went through that experience as well, and I mean this in no disrespect towards them, they don't know everything regarding that whole experience either, because there was a whole slew of people that went through that experience on both sides and in different countries all over the world that had many different experiences. And when we look at history, and I'm using this example because I was a history major in college and I'm more familiar with this world and example. When we look at history and we read a textbook, we don't just see the story of just Holocaust survivors. No, we'll see stories from former Nazi soldiers. We'll see experiences from the American, from the English, from the Japanese, from all over the world. We'll see their stories and how they combine to make a larger picture. And we see in the end who ends up being right, who ends up being wrong, because we have the whole picture, or at least a good idea of the whole picture, and we can make a more intelligent and accurate assessment by that. And the same is true for our walk of life and faith and politics. The bigger the picture we can look at, the more information we can put on in front of us, we can make a wiser and more intelligent assessment and understand from there.
Yeah. You know, when you're talking about politics, some people too, I think, conflate moral arguments and political arguments. For example, both of us would hold very strongly to the issue of the sanctity of life, the protection of the unborn. We would hold very tightly to the sanctity of marriage, that it's between a man and a woman. So we're not saying that, you know, should we compromise these things? Should we? No, we're not saying that at all. These are moral biblical issues that are settled beyond our opinion. These are things that God has set in stone in the scripture. The thing that's dangerous, though, while we hold strongly to the opinion of the sanctity of life, the sanctity of marriage, our failure to dialogue with people that come from maybe a different background, who have suffered certain things. For example, you know, being conservative, people identify that with a Republican, more corporate kind of thing, that oftentimes people feel neglects the poor. You know, you're just for giving tax breaks to the rich. That's what a lot of people hear when they think Republican, right? So they think you're insensitive to the poor. So where the dialogue is helpful, let's say somebody that is maybe believes in personal responsibility, believes in, you know, hard work, makes opportunities, maybe more of a right-leaning thing. If they can be compassionate and listen to the fellow that didn't have the same opportunities that they did to make a success in life, and think, how can we, level the playing field so that everyone has an opportunity to make the American dream their own? That's the kind of thing we're talking about, where we need to have it. Very seldom, Cameron, can I think of times where political discussions were made that were not volatile, that were not mudslinging, that were not just, got personal very quickly. And again, those things are usually the evidence of someone who doesn't have a good argument, so they get personal real quickly. But of all people, I heard Ben Shapiro and Bill Maher on one another's shows talking with a pretty high level of civility about the state of our nation, about the way things are going. Now, you couldn't find two people that are more polar opposites, but I think for respect's sake and to try to advance dialogue, and because they both value freedom of speech, which is something that's under fire today, they were having a pretty healthy dialogue. And if people that have been watching will know that Bill Maher has been coming out quite strongly against the woke culture, because he's very left of center, but yet he sees some of the fallacy and some of the extreme woke stuff. And so he's been kind of calling his own party to account on some of this stuff. So he and Shapiro are having this discussion. And I thought, man, I would not have thought that this would have been possible, that people that are so devoted to and everybody knows how strongly conservative Ben Shapiro is. And both of them are pretty sharp cookies. Both of them have very different opinions, and yet they were having civil dialogue. And I thought, it's too bad that we can't, even in the church, seem to muster this. Neither one of those are born again Christian people. One of them is a Jew, and the other one is, I don't know what Bill Maher is. I don't know what he would identify as. I know he's an atheist. He's very out front about that. But I'm just saying, from the standpoint of, if those two people can have civil dialogue about their disagreements, why can't people in the church get together and dialogue positively? I don't know why in the church it always has it evolve to you're a heretic. It seems like that's where it always goes. And seldom is that even remotely true. Now, yeah, if somebody's denying the virgin birth, if they don't believe that Jesus is the, only begotten Son of God, I get it. That's different. But seldom, Cameron, are those the issues that, they're dealing with. So I don't know. It just seems to me we could, what somebody said really well, the Bible said, be quick to speak, or be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the wrath of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. It's been well said, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we would do better to do twice as much listening as we do talking. I think that would be helpful.
I think one of the things I heard when I was younger that made a world of difference to me was a pastor was hanging out with this kid, and I don't remember, it was a pastor we knew, and an individual was telling us this story, but they were hanging out with her son, and the pastor was just listening to this kid talk on and on and on about fishing. And at the end of it, the mom's like, you could just tell him to like shut up anytime you want if he's just like bothering you. And he's like, I'm never going to learn anything when I'm talking, but I just learned a lot that I never knew about fishing. And he's like, you're never going to learn anything if you're always doing the talking. Yeah. And I value that so much, and have made that just a chief value of mine, that I always want to be listening more than I'm talking. And even when I ran Bible studies, I always made sure that I wasn't the only one talking. And I would use awkward silences as a sharp weapon to get other people to talk, because everyone feels uncomfortable when it's just awkwardly silent. Someone asks a question, nobody answers, someone's eventually going to crack. And so it's a great opportunity, because through those studies, and I would end up asking certain people and like make it direct towards them, I gained a lot of insights, because I already know all the insights I have. I already know everything I know, and I'm not going to learn anything by only hearing what I have to say. But it's through those people, because some of those people came from a different background from me. So they'd ask a question, and I was like, wow, I've never considered it from that perspective. And so you're never going to learn anything by only talking. And I think we should, like you said, do twice as much listening as we do talking. If I could have it my way, I would do way more listening regularly than I ever do talking. And that's one of the nice things about working from home, is that oftentimes I might have something running in the background that I'm listening to, learning, growing, because I think we should always be striving to learn and grow. Because like I said earlier, the things that you love most or know most, you might not have learned yet.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we all could use a healthy dose of curiosity. And, if you went to the doctor and you told him, "Doctor, I've lost my appetite," he would immediately be concerned, because everybody knows the loss of appetite can be a very clear indicator of poor physical health. Spiritually, if you're not hungry for God, I would say that's a very clear indicator of poor spiritual health. But if you're not curious anymore, then to me, that's a good indicator of poor mental or emotional health. When I talk about emotional, I'm talking about emotional intelligence, not wanting to be able to have insights into others, be willing to listening to them, not wanting to learn. The more you learn, you were the one who said it. What was the guy's name on Jeopardy that won Jennings, Steve
Ken
Jennings?
Jennings.
And he said, I wanted to learn all this so I could communicate with people. There's a lot of wisdom in that. The world you can't enter is the world you can't reach. If you can't find points of connection with people that come from a different perspective, then you probably aren't going to be able to reach them. Even if it's something as simple as connecting on a common interest like sports, you have a way in, a segue. Whereas if you're coming from two different worlds that can never connect, it's going to be very different to have any kind of constructive dialogue or relationship. So I think what we're saying tonight is be willing to question not just your answers, but question, not just question your questions, but question your answers, and ask yourself, why do I believe that? Let me just say this real quick. One of my own personal experience with this, when I was growing up in the Baptist church, I began to get hungry. And I love something that I think it was Tommy Barnett, the senior Tommy Barnett, pastor of First Assembly of God of Phoenix, who said, it was attributed to him. I never heard him say it, but it was attributed to him by somebody else. God would never put it in the heart of a bird to fly south if there was no south. So I began to get hungry for something that I couldn't articulate. But that means if you're hungry for something, then what that something is there. We've all had the experience probably of swinging on a refrigerator door, looking in there and saying, no, I'm not hungry for that. No, I'm not hungry for that. But you're hungry for something. And I was hungry for something spiritually, but I couldn't articulate what it was because we didn't have it in our Baptist refrigerator. I'm not picking on the Baptist, just my context. But then when I began to get hungry and begin to pursue God and begin to get an understanding that maybe there was some things we didn't have in our fridge that I needed in our fridge and I needed in mine. And I remember, Cameron, what a shaking experience that was. And I was slow to believe these friends of mine who had a different doctrinal persuasion, even though that was the answer to what I was hungry for. And I remember God over a period of time asking me this question. Now, it didn't come in this form. I didn't hear an audible voice, but it was more or less like this: Randy, are you perfect? In other words, do you know all things? Is there nothing that you don't know? Is there any opinions out there that could be true that you don't hold? And I realized immediately upon the receipt of that question that, oh yeah, no, I'm not perfect. There's a lot I don't know. And he said, that means there's a lot you hold to be true that may not be. And that shook me because I thought, the same people that told me that we were right in our denomination told me that Jesus is Lord, told me that God exists. If they're wrong about that, what if they're wrong about this other stuff? And it shook me to the core. It was like an earthquake underneath my feet. Long story short, my faith stayed intact, but I embraced some other things. I've questioned those things from time to time and looked at them critically, not to dismiss them or to disown them, but just to say, how can I better articulate this? Or am I sure that my standard position on these things, in other words, why just exchange one group of assumptions you learn from one set of people for another set of assumptions you learn from a different set of people without trying them, without putting them to the test? And I think we have to be willing to do this. The Word of God is the ultimate plumb line, not, our opinions or the denomination from which we came. And if we're afraid of a little scriptural examination of why we believe what we believe, or are afraid to look at a different perspective, that doesn't bode well, because they are going to get challenged one way or another. We might as well do it willingly and embrace truth, like you said, over tribe, over perspective, over personal preference and opinion, because truth is what ultimately matters.
Absolutely. And I definitely could keep talking on this subject, but I realize the time and how far we've gone. So I think I'm going to wrap up in prayer for us.
Yeah, let's do that.
Lord, we thank you that you are our God, and you are a God of truth, that you are a God of understanding and wisdom, of knowledge. And I thank you that you are just opening our hearts right now to receive what you are speaking to us. Maybe there's a word or some aspect of truth we've been avoiding, but I pray that you just open our hearts to receive it. That if there is an assumption or a presupposition that you open our hearts for it to be challenged, that we're willing to challenge what we believe so that we can grow, that we can grow in understanding and maturity, so that we can reach more people like you, that we can reach more people like you reach people, that we can go into their lives, into their culture, and make a difference. God, we just thank you that you are someone that is always drawing us closer towards you, towards your kindness, your mercy, your grace. And we thank you that we're willing to step out of our echo chambers and to find new communities, communities that can speak new information into us, challenge us, but not in a spiteful way, but in a way to help us grow. We thank you, Lord, for what you're doing in and through our lives. And in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. Next week is what? What is next Wednesday? We're getting close to the holiday season, but
next Wednesday is the 21st.
Okay, so I think we'll still be on for next Wednesday. And I know there's coming up a week where I'm going to be gone, but we'll be here next week. So I think we'll have another broadcast. So thanks for being with us, everybody, tonight. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Right. Bye-bye.